Alright, so in today's video we're going to go over some of the finer details of handrail floating. We're going to potentially be using a few different spindles. This one's sunflower, horseweed, and seep willow, and a few different fireboards, cottonwood branch, western red cedar, and cottonwood root. So we're going to be talking about hand motions, how much of your hand you should be using and how to move them. We're going to talk about how to achieve downward pressure, and we'll talk about stances to use. So stick with me and I'll get the camera adjusted and we'll get started. Alright, so the first set we're going to use is sunflower on cottonwood branch. So first I'm going to talk about the hand motions. And I'm using the basic sitting stance. I have the fireboard pinned under my left foot, and I'll be working out in front of me. So, for our hand motions, we're going to be going from as far up on our fingertips as we can to the heel of our hand. We're going to be moving one hand up and the other down, simultaneously in a circular motion. This is what it looks like when it's less exaggerated. So you can still see my hands are dipping up and down, but not quite as much as they were in that first bit of demonstration. So right now, I'm using close to my fingertips and then back towards the end of my hand. The downward pressure comes from the downward scoop. And then just like with your standard hand drill stance, you are pushing in and down very hard. A good way to identify how much pressure you need is to clamp your hands on your spindle nice and tight and try to push them down the spindle. It shouldn't be easy. It should be hard to make them slide. I haven't put a specific weight to how much the pressure actually is, but it's significant. Now with floating, a lot of that pressure is being applied through your arm, especially in your forearm muscles right here. It's a muscle group that you might not really be used to utilizing, so it might get kind of tiring. So I'm going to burn in each of these 3 sets in each of the 3 different stances. So this one is the sitting stance. And we have a burn-in. I realize that the angle on this stance isn't very helpful. I'll link the last video I made on floating so that it can be seen a little bit better. But for now, that's all we're going to do with this set. Just getting a burn-in. So now I'll adjust the camera and move on to the next stance. Alright, so the next stance is going to be the standard kneeling stance. We're going to be using western red cedar and seep willow for this one. So with this stance, I have my fireboard trapped under my left foot within about 3 inches or so of the hole. So I'm going to be working out in front of me, but now I have a little bit of downward pressure added just by my body weight being over the top. In terms of the hand motions, it's exactly the same, just utilizing as much of the hand as possible. And we have it burned in. And so now the last stance that we're going to be utilizing is going to be horseweed on cottonwood root. Now this is going to be the assisted kneeling stance. So I'm going to be using another piece of wood to hold down my fireboard. So I'm going to adjust the camera a little bit to make that easier to see, and then we'll get going. Alright, so with the assisted kneeling stance, I have my fireboard down. I have a second piece of wood, in this case a split of cedar, on top of it, and I'm holding the split under my knee. So this is going to allow me to be directly over the top. This is the best stance to use if you have a hard time getting pressure in sitting or standard kneeling stance. So we'll go ahead and get started. As you can see, my body, my chest, is right over the spindle. That adds a lot of extra pressure just from my body weight being on top. And we have our burn-in. So now that we have talked about the 3 different stances, let's talk about a little bit more of why we might use each one. So we'll start with the assisted kneeling stance. As I mentioned, this is a great way to utilize your upper body weight directly down on top of your spindle. Now, that might seem a little bit hard to understand. So think of it simply as you have extra weight going right over the top. You have your chest over the top of this spindle at an angle somewhat like this. Just being there helps. It isn't anything really fancy. It's a pretty intuitive way to do it if you don't like kneeling with it under your foot. But it can be very helpful, especially when using shorter spindles. This one's only around maybe 13 to 14 inches. So on the shorter side for a hand drill spindle. Whereas the Seep Willow was around 20 inches and is much easier to utilize in the normal kneeling stance. Now, of course, you could utilize a longer spindle in this stance as well. Realistically, it's not going to make too big of a difference with a spindle that size because you can't really get your body weight over the top. Next, we'll go to the regular kneeling stance. So that was our Seep Willow on cedar. Standard kneeling stance is what a lot of people will do by default. It's an easy, comfortable stance if you're used to bow drill. It's a little bit awkward for some people to be working inside their leg, and they might have a tendency to kind of work on the outside or top of their knee a little bit, which would limit their hand movements. And that's not really going to be beneficial for them. But with a long spindle like this, you can utilize any of the 3 stances pretty well. Now for our sitting stance with the sunflower on cottonwood branch. The sitting stance is in my mind, is one of the harder ways to do it. You have no body weight going over the top. You don't really have any muscular advantage like you might with the kneeling stances. You're just working directly out in front of your body. And so you're having to utilize a lot more muscle in your arms, shoulders, and forearms than you do in the other stances. That's not to say it's a bad stance. When using short spindles, it can be the easiest way to go because you're not limited by your body weight going down over the top. Your hands don't slide down quite as fast. You have better control over that. I have a hand drill set with a 12-inch Seep Willow spindle. That one I have a really hard time using in a kneeling stance because the spindle is just so short, and so I'll utilize the sitting stance. I think that's where the sitting stance shines, is with smaller spindles. Like I said, you can use a long spindle in that stance. It'll be fine. It just requires a little bit more work from your arms, shoulders, and back. Now, we talked about hand motions a couple of times, so now I'm going to show you on my hands specifically where the spindle is going to ride. Alright, so let's see if we can get this in frame here. Most of the strength in your hand is in this L, from the front pad of your hand to the heel. But that limits your rotations if you're only in that area. You can ride all the way up to your fingertips with good technique. I normally stop around here at about first knuckle. That's just what feels best for me. And that's what a lot of it comes down to, is what feels good for you. You can go all the way from fingertip to heel, or you can go just a little bit less how I do. Ultimately, you can short stroke and just use the middle of your hands. It's just not very effective, not very efficient. And so another thing to mention with hand motion, if your hands are stiffened out, where your fingers are arching back, feel the padding at the front of your hand right here. It's a lot less when it's stiffened out. Now soften your hand. Suddenly there's a lot more squish. You want your hands to be soft, otherwise you may develop blisters a little bit faster. Now, how I normally will do it is I'll use as much as I can while I'm warming up my set. Normally while I'm floating, I use as much of my hand as I possibly can use. Then if I have to start making passes down a spindle, I will start to use shorter strokes. So let me see if I can show that. So with floating, I'm using long hands, and then say I'm going to go a little bit heavier, using a little bit less now. Now I'm using mostly from here to about here. Now, like I had said before, this region of your hand is where all the strength is. And you can use that portion of your hand just fine on its own. But you're going to be missing out on some extra rotation if you're not going all the way up your fingers. I've had some students that would take the spindle back pretty much to the wrist, and you lose a lot of control that way. So try to stop it right about here, the heel of the hand. Move it at least to this first knuckle on your fingers, and further if you can. And that'll be how you can get the best out of your rotational ability with your hand drill. So long hands, soft hands, and push down really hard. You can go really fast, or you can go kind of slow. There's a happy medium in the middle of those. But really anywhere in that can work. There are some people that prefer to use more speed and really heavy pressure, and some people that prefer less speed with moderate pressure, or high speed with very little. And a lot of that can depend on the materials as well, and can come down to trial and error and what works best for you. So I'm going to adjust the camera, give you a look at all three hand drill sets again, and then we'll close out this video. Alright, so again, going from the bottom up, we have a sunflower spindle with a cottonwood branch fireboard, a horseweed spindle with a cottonwood root fireboard, and a seep willow spindle on a western red cedar fireboard. I do have other spindles here of those three materials, and other fireboards of those three materials, and I will be adding them onto my Etsy shop here shortly as specific sets with specifics as to their spindle length, fireboard thickness, and materials, etc. Alright, if this information has been valuable to you, please give me a like, share, and subscribe. I'll have these hand drills on my Etsy shop here in the next week or so, and I will see you next time with another video. Thanks.